Hey everyone, Tactics here. We're bringing you another Season 3 dungeon guide where we're covering the second returning dungeon from Season 1, and that is the Dawnbreaker. Like the Arakara video that I put out already, instead of doing a full guide, I'm only going to be covering the most important or significantly adjusted abilities going into Season 3. Plus, I will give you a bunch of tips that we learned over the course of playing this dungeon in Season 1 that will hopefully help you out for the beginning of the season. But if you want a fully in-depth guide with everything you could think of, you can check out my written article hosted over on the Method website, which I will be linking down below. Otherwise, let's dive right into the dungeon, where off the bat there are some changes to the caster mob as well as the lieutenant mob that you face before the first boss. So first off, the curse ability, Ensnaring Shadows. This is now instant cast. Previously it was interruptible, so you never actually needed to deal with it, but now because it will always go off, you need a curse spell in your group to make sure that you can actually get rid of it. Otherwise, those players are going to be in a bit of danger and will need a defensive or some extra healing. There's also a magic dot in this area still in Stygian Seed, so ideally that curse to spell comes from not your healer because they're going to be busy dispelling this ASAP, and from the same Nightfall Ritualist mobs, they also have the Tormenting Ray ability, which is the most dangerous form of unavoidable damage in this first area, so the two targeted players want to watch their health and press defensives as needed. The Nightfall Commander Lieutenant up on the Dawnbreaker ship itself has had their Abyssal Howl ability changed. This is no longer interruptible again, so -1 interrupt, but it no longer deals group damage. Instead, it puts a magic shield on all nearby things and grants them 10% additional damage while that shield holds. The shield itself is quite small, so you'll most likely just AoE it off, but if you really need to, it is a magic buff, so you can purge it. Once you make your way onto the ship, the Dawnbreaker, it will take off, and you'll eventually need to fly to two ships that are slowing down your progress. On these ships are Sareki web mages. You can put your spare kicks on the web bolts. Your priority kicks throughout this whole first area are going to be on the night bolts from the Nightfall Shadow mages, because that actually hits random players, whereas the web bolt just hits your tank. The main ability you want to be aware of from these web mages, though, is the Bursting Cocoon, kind of similar to the other debuffs here. It's going to target one player and deal damage to them specifically, so you want to make sure that you are moving away from your allies so you don't cleave them, and also using a defensive if needed. After you destroy the two ships halting your progress, you go back to the Dawnbreaker and you can fight the first boss, Speaker Shadowcrown, which is a boss that's gotten some updated visuals here as well as some numbers tuning, but is otherwise the same. The Shadow Bolt tank hit has gotten a damage increase on it, so it's important to have a decent kick rotation, whereas previously you kind of could ignore it. But at the same time, they've nerfed the Obsidian Beam tank hit, a pretty significant nerf here, so while you still will want to use a defensive, it's much easier to survive, and you won't need to layer like 3 or 4 defensives to survive each hit. For non-tanks, particularly ranged players, you want to make sure that you do stay away from the boss in order to bait the collapsing night void zones. These always spawn on 2 random players, and it does prefer range. So if you have 2 or more ranged players in your group, it will always target them. But if you only have 1, then you need to be aware that that player will always get it, and then a random melee will always get it as well. So you'll need to move the boss away from these void zones. In terms of group damage, there's the Burning Shadows debuff. There's a magic dot on a single player that will explode into a healing absorb upon being removed, so healers, make sure you are prepared for when you actually remove it. There's also the previously mentioned Obsidian Beam cast, which on top of that tank hit also does a group hit and then spawns 3 beams that rotate around the boss for 7 seconds, which is why you need to make sure that you move away from those previously mentioned void zones, just so you have enough room to spin with the beams without walking through them. When you push the boss to 50% health, they'll begin to cast Darkness Comes, instantly killing anyone on the ship or nearby it after 15 seconds. So when this happens, you hop on your Dragonriding mount and you fly outside of the explosion radius before you return to the boss platform after it detonates. From 50% to 0, the boss fight is essentially the same, with the only difference being there's now 4 beams instead of 3 spinning during the Obsidian Beam cast. Otherwise, it's the same until you push the boss to 0% health. We'll also cast Darkness Comes once again, and at this point, you can just mount up and fly down into the city below, where there is more trash waiting for you. Now, they've changed several of the trash mobs in this area, and they've also changed the composition of a lot of the packs. So the previously mentioned Lieutenants, Nightfall Ritualist, and the Nightfall Commanders only used to show up at the beginning of the dungeon before the first boss. They're now spread out throughout the city as well, so you'll be facing them in this area. Also in this area, the most important thing is you make sure you hunt the 3 lieutenants, each of which are in a static position around the dungeon here and will have an ability that kind of previews one of the boss's abilities. It is important you kill all 3 of these lieutenants because the boss gains stacks of empowered might for each living attendant, which basically makes the boss unkillable. So you want to make sure you remove all those stacks by killing all 3 of them. In the cathedral, you'll deal with Excretin the Unbreakable, and his boss ability is Terrifying Slam. This is a tank hit that is a large circle around them that also knocks them back and fears anyone that was in that circle. You just want to make sure you put yourself up against a wall or something like that, and everyone else can run away out of that circle, and you just press a defensive. Death Screamer Ikantak is down near where the boss is, and their ability is Dark Orb. This one is pretty scary. It will shoot this orb at a random player after a short delay, and then whenever this orb contacts terrain, it will explode for group damage based on the distance traveled. The further it travels, the less it does. Also, will run people over and put a debuff on them, which is very, very dangerous. You want to make sure you avoid that. I recommend tanking this guy along the path towards the outside of the city, and you aim those orbs just outside the city so that they shoot as far as possible before detonating. The last lieutenant, kind of between the 2 that we just mentioned, is Ascendant Vizcoxria, and his ability is a Shadowy Decay. This is just pulsing shadow damage for 3 seconds, so healers want to be prepared with healing cooldowns for this, especially if you're taking damage from another source or you're targeted by one of the Abyssal Blast casts. This is just a random target dot ability that all 3 of the lieutenants had, and it can make things quite dangerous as it does quite a bit of damage. The initial damage was nerfed a little bit here going into Season 3. However, previously a strategy was to line of sight the cast of this ability. That no longer works, so you will just need to make sure you tank this and use a defensive if it overlaps with anything else. In terms of the other trash in this area, we've got quite a few changes. So to start off, you've got the Nightfall Shadow Walkers. You guys previously had a tank hit in Umbral Rush that's been replaced now with a passive that stacks up a 1% healing reduction on the tank. It's only 5 seconds long, so if you ever do need to drop your stacks, you can use things like CCs or kite these mobs until that debuff goes down. But just be aware, it can stack up quite quickly, especially if you pull a lot of these mobs. The Manifested Shadows Voidwalker type mobs have also been nerfed. They previously had an AoE ability they would cast at 0 mana. That's been removed entirely, and the initial damage on their dot has also been decreased. So these mobs are a lot safer to play. At the same time, Animated Darkness, the little blob mobs that were kind of spread out throughout this area, have also been made a little bit easier. Their kick has been removed entirely, and instead they now explode on death, similar to the mobs at the end of Priory, the Risen mobs. And just like them, if you stun them or CC them right before they die, they actually do no group damage. Outside of that, the only mobs to be aware of are the Dark Casters, who have the main spare interrupt in the Tormenting Beam, which you can also CC if the channel has begun, and then the Nightfall Tacticians, who will be slamming your tank with melee hits, especially if they get the Tactician's Rage and Rage buff on them, so make sure you soothe that if possible. They also have a tank targeted frontal, so just point this away from your group. That brings us to Anub'ikkaj himself, who, as mentioned previously, has one of each of those mini-boss abilities. However, his are a bit more powerful. So there's the channel damage from Shadowy Decay, which now ramps up in power over the duration. And once again, healing CDs and group defensives are best used here, particularly for when it overlaps with that Dark Orb cast. Again, to reduce this orb damage, you want to aim it outside of the city. I recommend you can tank the boss where he is. The tank can be on the city side of the boss, and the rest of your group can be on the other side of the boss, aiming the orbs down the path out of the city to have it do as minimal damage as possible. The Terrifying Slam tank hit also makes a return, so be ready with defensives. And if you don't have a way to prevent or mitigate the knockback that it does, you can actually position yourself against the fence corners near while you're tanking the boss, and that will actually stop that knockback entirely. Very useful for all my paladin friends out there. There's also an ability that you haven't seen yet in Animate Shadows, which spawns a bunch of these slime mobs around a random player, and then they'll just try and cast a random target shadow hit. So you want to use interrupts and AoE CCs to make sure none of those casts are successful while you cleave them down under the boss. Beware that if you are targeted by one of these casts that is going to be successful and it overlaps with any of the previous raid damage mentioned, you may want to press a defensive just to make sure that you don't get wombo comboed. After defeating the boss, you can fly back up to the Dawnbreaker, where there is a single mini boss in the Nightfall Dark Architect. This guy is the same. He hits the tank pretty hard, and then he alternates between targeting 2 sets of players with Tormenting Eruption, similar to the Tormenting Ray earlier, but this one also cleaves. So watch your health when you are targeted. They will need additional spot healing, and they may need to press defensives. At 75%, 50%, and 25% health, this mob will channel Usher reinforcements, spawning 3 of any of the previously mentioned Nightfall mobs in some combination that are fairly nerfed. They're 80% less damage than their original copies, but they still do all their normal abilities. So tanks beware, you'll get stacks of that healing reduction. Curses may go, it depends on what combo you get. So just try and group them all up and cleave them underneath the Dark Architect. After you defeat that Architect, Rasha'nan will hop onto the side of the Dawnbreaker, allowing you to begin phase 1 of this 2-phase encounter, which lasts until you push the boss below 64%. In this phase, the bulk of your damage is actually going to be coming from the Arathi bombs, which are dropped in sets of 3 onto the deck of the Dawnbreaker and must be picked up and then brought to Rasha'nan and thrown at her within 20 seconds of landing, or they explode for heavy group damage, and if you do so successfully, they take just under 6% of the boss's health per bomb. In general, I recommend having DPS do this job, as their damage is not super important in this phase. There's a lot of group damage, which we're going to talk about in a second, for the healer to deal with, and the tank has to stay within melee range of the boss, as she is stationary. Speaking of that group damage, the main form is from Erosive Spray. This stacks up a dot on your entire group, so it kind of ramps up in difficulty over the course of the cast. So just healers, be ready with some sort of cooldown or prepped healing when that goes out. Outside of this, players need to make sure they avoid the web lines that are shut out towards 2 random players at a time. And then the single player targeted by Rolling Acid needs to make sure that the wave this ability spawns shoots away from their group instead of through them, which is indicated by the green line and animation in the direction that the wall moves. Note that the target of this attack can't actually avoid it themselves, so they may need to press a defensive, especially if it overlaps with that previously mentioned Erosive Spray cast. Once you've pushed the boss low enough, she'll jump from the ship and fly away, allowing players to mount up and chase her. You'll need to make sure that you remain protected by the Radiant Light in this phase, which is a buff that you can maintain while near a light source, or by collecting some of the floating gold orbs along Rasha'nan's flight path. That being said, you don't actually need to follow her closely. As many players learned throughout the course of Season 1, you can actually just pick up an orb near where you fought Anub'ikkaj and then fly straight to the Phase 2 platform without losing your Radiant Light buff, which makes it a little easier. You need to fly for less time. When the boss finally does land on that platform and Phase 2 begins, she'll start with Acidic Eruption, which is an interruptible cast, so don't let that go off. Otherwise, there's only one new mechanic in this phase, replacing the Arathi bombs, which no longer drop, and that is Spinneret Strands. There's a 10-yard circle around 2 random players, leaves behind a web puddle, and then binds the target to the center of the circle while constantly dealing ticking damage to them. To remove that ticking damage, you need to snap the tether, which is done by running out of the web puddle, which also deals a hit of ray damage at the same time. This hit is relatively small, but it is something healers should be aware of, especially again, if it overlaps with that Erosive Spray dot. This puddle does serve as some area denial here for the remainder of the fight, so you want to put it away from the group if possible. However, when one of the rolling acid waves hits these puddles, it does shrink them a bit into an acid puddle. Still something you'll want to avoid and have put away from your group, but much smaller and allows for more room for your group. So removing them is a benefit, but not something you're going to go out of your way to do, because again, you don't want that wave to go through your group. From here, the boss just continues as normal, with the fight ending after pushing the boss to 60% health, not 0. But there we have it, guys. That's my Dawnbreaker recap for Season 3 of The War Within. Hopefully it's useful, and if it was, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like we've got Mythic Plus guides, raid guides, and a lot more pug-friendly routes coming very, very soon. Make sure you check it out. As always, I got to give a massive thank you to all my Patreons for making these videos possible, and I'll see everyone in the next video.